Well, officials in most of the undecided states say they do expect to see more results throughout the day today, bringing us one step closer to knowing who the next president will be.
And there are still a lot of variables at play, including possible recounts and several lawsuits. Joining us live to help make sense of it all is Portland State University political science senior instructor Jack Miller. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
Okay, so let's just first talk about, what's happened in the last 24 hours with all these thoughts of lawsuits being possibly filed in states, Trump saying to stop the counting where he's ahead. I mean, what do you make of all that? And do these lawsuits hold any sort of ground? Could they actually become a thing?
There's two things happening here. It's unprecedented for a candidate to call for the vote to be vote counting to stop when he or she is ahead. But what is definitely very common in American elections is for there to be lawsuits about the treatment of ballots. It doesn't happen with presidential elections all the time, but it's very frequent with congressional and state legislative elections where often several hundred votes decide the winner. And the way that several hundred ballots could be handled, if election officials, for example, don't examine a bunch of ballots for signatures or for proper filling out according to state law, there could be lawsuits about whether those ballots are actually valid or not. And in any close election, whether it's, say, a state legislative election that's decided by 200 votes or a presidential election that's potentially only decided by several tens of thousands of votes, those legal challenges can be very important, but there is no precedent for just stopping the counting of ballots.
It's interesting when we look at these recounts that you mentioned, sometimes at the state and local level, they can really have an impact. But we're looking at states where right now the margins, while they are close percentage-wise, are still several thousand or tens of thousands of votes. Do you see a situation right now where a recount could yield any kind of turnover?
Not really. In the past, when different voting methods were used and ballots were more confusing, like many people do remember the 2000 presidential election, one of the problems there was that Florida's ballots were these punch-out ballots where there were hanging chads, and sometimes accidentally you could punch out two of the holes so that it looked like you were actually voting for two candidates, and you can't vote for two candidates, so that ballot would be invalidated. One of the things that's been learned since then is how to make sure that ballots are going to be easy to fill out, easy to read and scan. Even in states that had ballots that have two sides, there was attention paid, I know this was true in Arizona, to making sure that if the ink bled through from one side to the other, that it didn't fill out a bubble on the other side. So these issues of layout and scannability, really, election officials have been paying attention to this since the 2000 election. So ballots are much cleaner than they used to be. What that means is that if you do a recount, for example, in Wisconsin, where the Biden lead is about 22,000, that might move, 1,000 votes in either direction just because of standard, error, like a 1 or 2% error in the count. But things are unlikely to move 20 or 30,000 votes, even in a state where there are 3, 4, 5 million ballots counted.
Right. And President Trump has expressed frustration over being in the lead on election night, and then all these votes coming in, legally cast ballots for Biden yesterday that were being counted. Do the Democrats really have that strong of a base as far as these mail-in votes and some of these early votes that were cast?
Well, I think they do, particularly in this election where there was a lot of effort on the Democratic side to get voters to vote early because of exactly these concerns that, in state laws vary, but in some states, if your ballot arrives after Election Day, it doesn't count even if you mailed it before Election Day. In other states, there's a period of sometimes 3 days, sometimes 9 days. North Carolina is an example where established state law, not new laws in response to coronavirus, but established state law give ballots a week to come in as long as they are postmarked by Election Day. And so in a state like North Carolina, there's always going to be a waiting period. But Democrats wanted to make sure that in states like Pennsylvania, where there may or may not be a 3-day waiting period, that the votes were actually there. What's happening right now is that there are in Pennsylvania hundreds of thousands of votes that arrived by Election Day that have yet to be counted. So these aren't even in that gray area of should they be accepted or not because they arrived on Wednesday.
Yeah, it's tricky when you go state by state, and the timing for every state is different. Jack, we're almost out of time here, but really quickly, I just wanted to ask you, the other thing that maybe isn't getting as much attention right now would be Democratic and Republican control of the House and Senate. And we're seeing the potential for things to really come down to the wire in both those groups. What are you watching there?
Well, yeah, I think that a lot of people expected, both Democrats and Republicans expected a blue wave election. And whatever ends up happening with the presidential election, it's clear that the Democrats aren't going to have powerful control over Congress. They might have a narrow window in the Senate. They might have 50 or even 51 votes. But that's not going to be enough with the Biden presidency to really roll on a policy agenda. So we're going to see for 2 to 4 more years of what we're familiar with now, which is divided government.
Okay. Jack Miller with PSU's Political Science Department. Thank you so much for your insight this morning.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, 7-Eleven